used to say the master of McLaughlin College, but now the head of McLaughlin College.
Well, that's a
The
better
title
term.
has changed. I want to give my obligatory reminder to any students in the room to please sign in at the register by the door if you have not already done so. The main reason for that is that McLaughlin College gives a certificate of participation to students who attend 6 or more of our lunch talks during the year, and the only way we know if you have is if you've signed in on 6 or more occasions. So please do. No certificate of participation for faculty or fellows. You get the intellectual but not tangible benefit of these things. There will be a whole lot of intellectual benefit today. Our speaker today, Fred Fletcher, is a long-standing colleague and friend, one of the many retired political science faculty who frequent our meetings and occasions. Fred is a national treasure, a national resource on politics of the media, politics and the media and politics. I'm trying to avoid saying things you're going to get to in your own presentation, but not just interested in these issues, but truly someone that government and our society look to as an authority on the kinds of questions he's going to be exploring with us today. The media is changing, not just because people look for information in different ways than they have before, but the business model of the media is changing, and the use of media by government and by non-governmental actors is changing. At a time when the importance of information is even greater than it always has been. So it is incredibly timely and incredibly important that we hear about news, fake news, media, and whatever other nouns and adjectives we would all bring to this important topic. So without any more ado, Fred, over to you. Thank you.
I always find it fun to come to these events. I'm never quite clear how David Leighton Brown knows things, but he seems to have known that Donald Trump would release his fake news awards last night when he set the date for this discussion. I'll get to that. I'll just add something that's not in my notes. I've been interested in this subject for nearly 60 years. When I first walked into a newsroom at the age of 19, my first real job as a reporter. And I never quite got over the buzz of being a daily journalist, even though I only did that for 3 years full-time, although I freelanced for a long time after that. And so I was really impressed by, I really enjoyed the movie The Post, which I highly recommend. The plot about Nixon and so on was very timely for today, but for me it was a nostalgia trip. They showed people working at a linotype, making type with hot lead. They showed the running of huge presses and trucks delivering packages of newspapers to stores and kiosks on the street. And it was really something from another era that had a kind of romance about it that is hard to duplicate in a quiet newsroom where everybody's working on a computer and not talking to anybody. So it's a different thing. Nevertheless, my background as a long time ago a journalist and an academic led me to a really good gig. A few years ago, I managed to get a job teaching journalistic ethics in the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of British Columbia from January 1st to April 30th, getting me out of Toronto winters. and convincing me that that's something that I wasn't quite clear about, that journalism ethics is not actually an oxymoron. There is such a thing, and it's important. What I saw there was that there were a lot of concern about the future of journalism, naturally, for people who were studying journalism and hoping to get a job. This ended in 2011, so it's a few years ago. But there was no discussion of fake news at all. It was all about the failed business model and some other problems of journalism. And I would say that for about 25 years now, people who care about journalism and its role in democratic societies have been worried about what was happening to the traditional media or traditional journalism. That's the phrase I'm going to use. News organizations become increasingly profit-oriented as they face new challenges and competition. There's kind of a long decline as audiences and advertisers drifted away from the traditional news sources, especially in the last 10 years, advertisers. But I think that the 2016 American presidential election was a kind of turning point. A different way, forced us to look at things in a different way and maybe to take them more seriously. So I would say that a task for journalism organizers, journalism leaders, and academics who study this stuff, as well as people who are concerned about the digital media and social media, we need to start figuring out how to navigate an information environment with very few markers of credibility or reliability. How do we figure this out? And so people are starting to actually talk about this. In the past few months, several government agencies in countries like France, Britain, Germany, Australia, and even Canada have started thinking about public policy options that they might use to try to deal with the question of fake news and the question of the reliability of information available to citizens. And some of you will probably know that over the last 3 years, an organization called the Public Policy Forum in Canada has undertaken a fairly long, major research project on the future of journalism. And they published a 100-page report called The Shattered Mirror, News, Democracy, and Trust in the Digital Age, this past year. And of course you can get it online, which is itself interesting. And I'm going to respond a little bit to what they say, although I don't entirely agree with them. The study is quite useful. It's a good literature survey. And even Facebook and Google have started to respond to concerns that have been raised about what they disseminate, even though they continue to insist that they're primarily neutral channels and not publishers with responsibilities for the content that they distribute. Now I want to talk about that a bit. I start by taking a step back and saying that democratic theorists have given, and public sphere theorists and democratic theorists generally have given the media significant importance in democratic societies, expecting journalism to be the foundation for an informed citizenry, to provide information that the citizens need so they can participate in debates about public policy and about the future of the country and meaningfully in the selection of leaders. And I've always liked a definition of journalism in a standard textbook by Kovacs and Rosenstiel, which says journalism is storytelling with a purpose. The purpose is to provide people with the information that they need to understand the world. And the first challenge of journalism is to find the information and determine what people need to know to live their lives effectively, and then to make it meaningful and engaging so people will actually pay attention to it. I'm going to say more about the competition for attention, which is a really important notion. But this kind of journalism is called in The Shattered Mirror civic function journalism. And it's a smaller, it's not the full range of journalism. Lots of journalism is not essential to democracy, but it is often essential to community building and telling people lots of things they need to know. however it's delivered. But the civic function journalism is the reason why democratic societies, liberal democracies anyway, have protections for freedom of the press in their constitutions. It's because the media are expected to be more than just commercial enterprises. They're expected to contribute to democracy. And in particular, to provide access to what I call a common vocabulary of precedents, or what some textbooks call shared verifiable facts. Things that people, it's hard to debate people when they don't, it's hard to get a debate among people when they share nothing. So the media have always provided that foundation. Now, fake news, which is what's triggered current concerns about the future of journalism, and brought it to a higher level, is also storytelling with a purpose, or purposes. But of course the purposes are different. And so I wanted to spend some time thinking about what fake news is. I wanted to ask myself, how dangerous is fake news to democratic political systems? And what's the relationship between the decline of traditional journalism and the rise of fake news? So it's useful to think about what news is. News differs from other content in the traditional media. News is a, you can say it's a report of an incident, a public comment, especially by persons of importance, a decision by some agency, a situation or condition which somebody, in this case the gatekeepers in the old system of journalism, decided was of significance and interest to their intended audience. So this applies pretty much to anybody who decides what they're going to report and what they're not going to report, whether they're a blogger or the Toronto Star. And when you work in news, you're always looking for a hook, something novel or unusual or surprising that will attract the attention of an audience. And if the hook advances an ongoing narrative, like high-profile sexual abuse, or the weirdness of Donald, the stable genius Trump, that's fine, that's good, because the hook is not the purpose. The hook is to get the attention of people who will then look at something that the reporters and journalists think of as important. So we have to look at the positive and the negative side of internet before we start thinking about fake news, which is primarily online. The internet was really important in expanding the voices that could be heard and getting past the gatekeepers of the large corporate media. We can think about lots of benefits of that. But the current crisis arose from this, not so much the existence of fake news. Fake news has always existed, but the proliferation, the distribution, effectively, of fake news. So let me say a few things about what fake news is and isn't. First of all fake news is false, but not all false news is fake. So we have the example of the false report, apparently, of the 11-year-old Toronto girl and the assault on her hijab, which turns out to be false, even though the media that reported the story took all the standard verification precautions that journalists normally take. It's not really fake news, though. It's more of a hoax. Hoax is the category of falsity, but it's not fake in this sense, because it's not intended to do anything but get attention. We don't know actually what the motive was, but in any case, the Toronto Star, for example, followed standard procedures, and it appeared to be true until the police were able to access the surveillance tapes and determine that it wasn't true. Then a few other things that fake news is not. It's not news you disagree with, although if you look at the Donald Trump Fake News Awards, you'll see that that is the most important criterion that he uses to identify what he calls fake news. The second is actual mistakes, which he identifies, especially when they have to do with him. So that's using fake news as an epithet, a curse word, to try to undermine the credibility of people you don't like or agree with. So you might have news with a partisan slant. You might have news that appears to be biased or incomplete or misleading. But that's a standard practice. That happens to everyone who sticks their head up. If you speak publicly, if you write publicly, you're going to make mistakes. Your own point of view will be reflected in what you write. But professional journalists have a series of safeguards to try to reduce that. It's impossible to eliminate it. And what you have in the Donald Trump awards or in other things is people who are citing errors as fake news in what appears quite clearly to me to be an attempt to undermine the credibility of traditional journalism, which traditional journalists normally see themselves in opposition to the existing structure of power, just as Trump styled himself. But now that he's in the power, you can expect this kind of criticism. So looking for a definition of fake news, there are a whole bunch of things fake news isn't. One narrow definition is offered by the Canadian editor of BuzzFeed, which Craig Silverman, he defines fake news as stories that are 100% false and not the result of honest mistakes or partisan slant, that are created consciously to be false. That's the most important element of his definition. They're known to be false, they're deliberately false. Or they don't care whether they're true or not, because they're looking for a hook. And Silverman adds a third criterion with a financial motive. So that brings you not just to what occurs on Facebook or online, but back to the National Enquirer and other such things. Things you can get at the supermarket, which will tell you that Meghan Markle is pregnant, for example, or that some secret about a celebrity mainly. Come to that in a minute. One of the things we discovered in the proliferation of fake news in the last while is that some teenagers in Macedonia could create fake news and make a lot of money out of it. So that's very important, and I'm going to talk about that more as we go along. But they can make up sensational falsehoods, get themselves significant number of clicks on YouTube, Facebook, and make money out of it. And so their motivation was entirely money, although the postings tended to favor Donald Trump and to be negative to Hillary Clinton in the US presidential election. But that appears to be because there was a market. People who would believe this stuff and share it, which gave them the opportunity to make money out of it. So that's just financial. That's pure fake news, we'll say. Then there's another category of fake news, which we'll call ideological, where the motivations are not so much financial as partisan and ideological. And we used to call that propaganda. And a lot of the literature on propaganda, and there's a huge literature on propaganda, is worth looking at again. But from our point of view, thinking about democracy, these things have something in common, these different kinds of fake news. They both debase public discourse. They make deliberative democracy more difficult. So we can see fake news as stories fabricated for attention, hoaxes and pranks, or financial gain. And we should say, we must stress that fake news is presented as factual. It's not presented as opinion. It's intended to mislead people into treating fiction as fact, or doubting something that is regarded as true, that somebody wants to undermine. So, I first sort of noticed fake news when I was a graduate student, when the research methods course professor asked us to go and look at supermarket tabloids. And discovered all kinds of weird stuff about celebrities. The celebrities were the focus then, and politicians being the focus is relatively new. But now we have politicians who become celebrities, like Justin Trudeau, and celebrities who become politicians, like Donald J. Trump and maybe Oprah Winfrey. So that brings two elements together and carries fake news along with it. The BuzzFeed did a study of the fake news, the main fake news elements that they discovered. They looked at the top 50 stories that they classified as significantly false. And they discovered that this is something new. They were mostly about politics during the US presidential election period, all of 2016. 49% of the top 50 stories were, maybe half we'll say, were political hoaxes. The other major category was crime. And these were so surpassingly weird that I'm not going to give you any examples. But I'm going to give you examples of some of the fake news they identified that was political. Somebody posted the following headline: Obama signs executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide, which purported to be from ABC News. But it was some other outfit. It had a slightly different domain name. Or Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president. Some outfit called End the Fed. Nobody could find out who owned it or who they were. Or some outfit called the World Daily News Report posted the following headline: ISIS leader calls for American Muslims to support Hillary Clinton. So, but there was a crossover. In the Denver Guardian, which is a non-existent newspaper, but they claimed on the Facebook post to be a newspaper, FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide. This is part of a series of stories which claim that Bill and Hillary Clinton have murdered 44 people over the past 25 years. Shows how incompetent the FBI is, if that's the case. Then the one that got the most attention was the Pizzagate conspiracy story that was very widely circulated, thousands of hits. And as you all may remember, it inspired an armed man to enter a Washington pizzeria in search of this non-existent child sex ring, so that he didn't shoot anybody, fortunately, and he's now, I'm not sure whether he's in jail or a mental institution, but he was incarcerated. The thing about that, though, and this is where this really gets a bit worrying, The Economist commissioned a poll which found that 46% of Trump voters and even 17% of Clinton voters still believed there was something true about this story about the Clinton-sponsored sex ring in this pizza place in Washington, D.C. I'm not clear whether the pizza place suffered damage or gained financially from this. And looking at how this circulated, it circulated mainly through Facebook, this particular story. So Facebook is, Facebook is an example of there's several social media that have been crucial to the spread of fake news. And if we think about three key elements of the emergence of social media, we find that there are three elements, I think anyway, that are important to both the rise of fake news and the decline of traditional journalism. First of all, one that may be regarded, I think it is positive, that social media have made it possible for almost anyone to produce and distribute text and video online at very low cost. Secondly, they're able to do this anonymously. But the most important thing, I think, is that over the past few years, social media postings have been monetized. You can get click or engagement fees from service providers. You can attract advertising. You can work as a social media influencer for some marketing corporation. Or you can just do things that are regarded as by your friends as hilarious, as a partisan troll. Their favorite word seems to be hilarious. And then social media, anything that can attract audiences will also allow the social media to aggregate personal data, which they can use from targeted marketing or sell. So we have a dilemma here if you're trying to think. I've been working with the World Internet Project for the last 15 years or so, and we try to figure out what the pros and cons are of social media. It's not easy to answer. You have things like the Arab Spring, you have things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, which are really facilitated by the existence of social media. And then we have fake news and trolls and all kinds of other crazy stuff on the other side. So we need to try to balance in our assessment the positive and negative elements of social media. But I think it's fair to say that when you look at fake news, the combination of anonymity, ease of posting, and monetization have enabled some of the worst forms of political communication to emerge. Propaganda-style falsehoods are spread in part by targeting. The personal data allows for targeted messages that appeal to people's prejudices, but are generally hidden from public view. They go only to a small, very narrow segment of society, so they don't get the kind of criticism and rebuttal that would happen if these hidden messages were actually available for scrutiny by somebody, by traditional media if there were any left, or others. I suggested in a research I did for a Royal Commission 25 years ago that we should make it illegal to circulate targeted messages without depositing them with the Elections Canada so that they would be available to opposition parties and the media. And I have to be careful because I signed an official secrets document. Let me say that I almost got the Commission to accept this recommendation, but not quite. So that was because of what was happening in the US even then with cable news. I didn't anticipate, unlike Marshall McLuhan, I didn't anticipate the internet. But I did anticipate targeted messaging. But perhaps what's really important when I'm going to suggest some public policy remedies is that fake news has a wider distribution than these targeted messages. They're something else. They're related. They're not identical. Fake news becomes news. It has a bigger audience. But anonymity shields the producers from the normal constraints of libel laws. And also, since nobody knows who they are, they don't face any damage to their reputation, so they can say anything. So, to return to one of the other questions, I'll come back to fake news in a minute. The concept of fake news implies there is such a thing as real news, or it wouldn't have a concept of fakeness. But it's important to remember that I pointed out earlier that fake news producers post their stories quite frequently using fake titles or logos that imply that they are traditional news organizations. So they build on the credibility of established news organizations, which I'll say is still fairly high in Canada. So I mentioned the non-existent Denver Guardian. Sometimes fake news is just accidental and reflects a kind of ongoing narrative or confirmation bias. The example of the shootings at the Quebec mosque, which is a year ago next week, Fox News reported that the shooter had shouted Allahu Akbar and was a Moroccan. It turned out that was false. And in fact, it took the intervention of the Prime Minister's office to get Fox News to retract it. But that's the kind of mistake that happens in the ideological context. So, what I want to address finally is, okay, here's a crisis, here's a problem. What can we do about it? What are the possible responses? I think maybe this is just my background or my dinosaur quality, but I think the existence of well-resourced and credible traditional news journalism with a strong commitment to the ideals of professional journalism, verification, impartiality, balance, effective storytelling, might by itself reduce the impact of fake news. But it requires resources, and across the board, traditional journalism has been losing resources and losing audiences. About 20 years ago, half of all Canadian households subscribed to a daily newspaper. The figure last year was less than 20%. It's beginning, and the projections by a consultant I know is that it will decline to under 5% in the next 5 years. So the printed daily newspaper is a dinosaur heading for extinction. But the result of this has been a decline in resources for traditional journalism. There's an estimate that as many as 12,000 jobs in journalism have been lost over the past 2 decades, mainly the last 10 years. Canada's largest newspaper, the Toronto Star, has reduced its newsroom staff from 470 to 170, which is a dramatic decrease. And newspapers are trying. Traditional news organizations are trying. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But advertising has stampeded in the last 10 years to social media. Google and Facebook suck up about 90% of the advertising budget now in North America. Doesn't leave much for traditional news organizations. So if you look at a television newscast now, you'll see mostly advertisements for people my age, basically. I'm impervious to the ads for hair restorer. I've been bald too long to worry about it. I see it. Now there's been a degree of decline. In fact, fake news is, in the US at least, fake news is added to the decline in trust in the traditional journalism as well. Here it's not so obvious. The most recent Ipsos public affairs poll shows that traditional news organizations, TV news broadcasts, print newspapers are the most trusted sources, if they survive, if you can find one. Online publications, much lower, and social media, only 15% of the survey respondents trust social media. I did a survey in 2003 that found approximately the same results, so it's a stable environment. But it means traditional journalism still has the potential to serve as a check on the fake news if it can do something about maintaining its share of audience and enough resources to function. And the way it looks to critics and observers is that it's like the CBC. When we poll about the CBC, the majority of Canadians want the CBC to be there, and they want traditional journalism to be available when they need it. But they don't want to pay for it, and they don't want to watch it most of the time, or read it most of the time, and so it's difficult to know where to go with this. They're trying. They're focusing resources more on investigative journalism and public service journalism, challenging large corporations, challenging government. They're trying to connect with their audiences by soliciting ideas, story ideas from their audiences. They're trying to be clearer about what is opinion, what is factual reporting, and what is analysis in their pages or on television. Because people have a problem with distinguishing these. And they're trying to do something significant with their online services. So, and CBC is succeeding fairly well. For the past 10 or 15 years, cbc.ca has been the most used online news source. And they sell advertising, but their competitors would like them to get out of advertising so that they could rake off whatever money is available. Should be supported by the taxpayer. And we know too, we've done some case studies at the local level and found that without traditional journalism, local coverage of city councils, police forces, parks boards, school boards have just disappeared. It's been replaced by ideological or advocacy-oriented online services, and one in particular, which is based here in Toronto, which is highly ideological and has no objection to ideologically oriented fake news. So what alternatives are there? The Shattered Mirror that I referred to earlier, the report by the Public Policy Forum, has suggested a bunch of things that could be done to help the traditional media, including tax breaks, subsidies for local news, better funding for the CBC. But most of all, mostly, the government hasn't accepted those recommendations. And they run into problems with those people who worry about the impact of government action on freedom of the press. So what we have, and I will say this too, and one of the things that many news organizations did was to add comment sections, but mostly they're disappearing because they were taken over by, I don't know, maybe trolls is a kind of a neutral term, ideologically motivated wackos. How about that?
People expressing negative online behavior.
Yeah. Well, let me
Trolls.
tell an anecdote. I was involved just with a sports online service, and I was trying to mediate between the fans of two different basketball teams. I went to both universities, so I just thought I could mediate. And there was a lot of people, and people were sending me really nasty messages, and I'm used to that after all. I've been a professor a long time. And finally some guy said, he sent me a message saying, "You seem like a nice fellow. What are you doing on this site?" It was, I wasn't nasty enough, you know, I was in the wrong headspace for this kind of operation. So traditional news organizations may not be able to help as much as we would like because they just don't have the resources or the audience. Some things may help if the government does act. So what else is possible? It's really asking Facebook and Google, or asking social media to think again about how they operate. Right now, as the Shattered Mirror said, it is cheap and easy and profitable for clickbait factories to fabricate content purely for commercial gain. It's just as cheap and easy for political provocateurs to manufacture disinformation designed to discredit their ideological opponents. It's very easy to circulate. So in terms of the consequences of this, we could guess, at least, that for citizens, it is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish fact and plausible interpretations of events from falsehood and conspiracy theories. Hard to know what sources to trust. Uh, and it's hard to break out of your own echo chamber. And just hearing what you want to hear, hearing what agrees with you, not grappling with people who disagree with you. So we're losing, according to some democratic theorists, the common understanding of our society that allows for debate, and the emergence of a common purpose, or what some people call the public interest. Fake news caters to existing prejudices, reinforces a tendency towards tribalism, some people have said, the emergence of partisan or ideological tribes, and a perceived enemy. Enemies seem to be important in the context of this headspace. So what else can we do? So the obvious suspects are saying the obvious things. We should pay greater attention to media literacy and critical thinking in schools. We've been saying that. I can't remember when we weren't saying that. Journalism should have greater transparency about its professional practices so people can trust it more. The Shattered Mirror recommends more government support for fact-checking and challenges to alternative facts. So there are quite a few that have emerged in the States, like Snopes, Brightline Watch, Media Matters, Fact Check, and others, and some university-based ones. And one of the things that's really growing is the university involvement in the process of gathering and disseminating information and working with journalists. So I'm involved a little bit with an outfit called The Conversation, which is started in Australia, but involves a number of universities and the former editor-in-chief of the Canadian Press to encourage a contribution to the media, because you'll see if you look at newspaper sites that are picking up stuff now from The Conversation. And I like the logo of The Conversation says academic rigor, journalistic flair. So other governments are getting into the act. The French government released a proposal, just a discussion paper, which first of all wanted to require news sites to reveal their ownership and financial backers. All websites, because anonymity is very common. They want to bring partisan news sites under the election spending rules, so that we could do that here if we decided that a news site was not a publication, but rather an advertisement, a partisan advertisement. We have rules that actually make that work. And allowing legal action to block sites. Germany has just passed a new hate speech law, which already has the toughest hate speech laws around. And they're making it, but it's applying it to the internet is what this legislation is intended to do. But I thought an interesting one was what Reporters Without Borders is doing. It's a media freedom watchdog, and they're proposing a public accreditation system for news sources. People have to apply for accreditation if they were running a news website, and they would have to talk about their verification methods, their financing, and their journalistic professionalism in effect. And then nobody would be taken off the air or taken down off the internet. But this would help people assess the credibility of the sources that they were using, a bit like accreditation for university programs and so on. But I think social media is really the area of most interesting possible government action. Facebook, Google, and Twitter should be held accountable for the content they distribute. Right now, they evade what is a long-standing legal principle, that publishers are ultimately responsible for everything they distribute, even if it doesn't originate with them. If you repeat a libel, you're also liable. So in principle, this is a good idea. I don't know how it would work out in law, but the kind of libertarian approach to the internet was such that they shouldn't be regulated, they shouldn't be subject to legal limits. at least people want the social media, people who make these suggestions want the social media to rethink their editorial policies and to remove or reduce the financial incentives that have fueled the fake news sites. And maybe banning clearly identified and persistent violators of fake news standards, of journalistic standards. So this leaves us with the difficult unanswered question: how can we create a new regulatory scheme that doesn't violate freedom of the press, freedom of expression? Or if we leave this to the social media giants, the big corporations, Google and Facebook, are we better off delegating this kind of editorial authority to them than we were when we were delegating it to major corporate news organizations? So we start thinking. And what I wanted to do was to talk about some of the things I'm thinking about and some of the things I think we should be thinking about. But I was really hoping to get some response to this. Thank you.
Okay, I'll let you recognize questioners rather than be a mediator.
Okay.
I think that one thing that I think will make regulation a bit more difficult is the emergence of social media, especially Twitter and Facebook. Because you'll notice it's a bit different. Like news on Twitter and news on Facebook is a lot different from like just watching Fox News or watching NBC. If I'm watching Fox News at 8:30, me and another person, we had the same TV on the same time, we're both watching Tucker Carlson. We're on CNN, we're both watching Anderson Cooper. But when it comes to Twitter or Facebook, because I get to choose who I follow, I get to choose who I'm friends with, two different people can like have a completely different news feed, have a completely different idea of what's going on in the world, because it's left to your own choice, own discretion. And then too much discretion then becomes a problem because not everyone's an expert. And it becomes a lot more difficult. Like, are we gonna like regulate who you're allowed to follow, who you're allowed? Then that defeats the whole purpose of the medium.
Yeah, it goes beyond that. That's entirely correct. But it goes beyond that. The algorithms for the social media also determine what you access and what you respond to, and they lock you in, even when you haven't chosen to be locked in. They lock you into that echo chamber. It just happens. But well, the response that they're talking about now is either to label postings as disputed or questionable. Most of the critics would like them to label things false or take them down if they were obviously false. They say, well, we don't assess what we carry. We're just neutral. But that's not true. They already try to remove pornography and hate speech in many jurisdictions. So they could extend this to fake news as well. It's just that it has possibly negative side effects, which makes it a problem.
I was just thinking about that at your last point. I was wondering if you could expand upon it a bit. You said that perhaps we could leave it to Google and Facebook rather than a regulatory scheme or some of the traditional enforcers. How do you envision that would look?
Well, they're talking about it already, and they're making proposals that they would, at the very extremes at least, ban persistent violators, but mainly they would just provide some kind of mark that would indicate that something was questionable. I don't think that's satisfactory myself.
You run up against a problem too, because Facebook's financials are based on attraction, whereas the financial health of traditional, accountable news media, they're trying to protect the credibility, so that there's a reason for them to try to be accountable, whereas it doesn't exist as profoundly with social media.
I think, in fact, that that's the most important notion, that we're now in a situation where we're flooded with information. We don't know how to navigate it very well. And there's a frenzied competition for attention. And by and large, the traditional news organizations are losing that competition. So, what can we do about that? I really don't know, but I would like to see. I said from the beginning, making me a bit of a pariah among my internet research colleagues, that I thought regulation was desirable. I didn't see why the internet should be treated any different than any other disseminator of information. But there was a libertarian streak among people I'll call the netheads, who just didn't like my point of view. But it seems to me that the fake news has given more support to some preference for. You were waiting.
Sure, you might know that in 1977, the Pierre Trudeau government changed the tax laws to deny a tax deduction to advertisements placed in media outside Canada where the ad was directed to Canadians. And so that was studied and proven to be helpful financially to Canadian magazines, newspapers, TV, radio, etc. There's a loophole now that so that this denial of a tax deduction doesn't apply to internet advertising. And the government knows about it, everybody knows about it, and has been slow to do anything about it. I'm thinking now that rather than just denying the deduction to offshore internet advertising, we deny it to any kind of internet advertising in order to, again, prop up our written media, newspapers and stuff. What do you think?
Well, you go even a little farther than the Shattered Mirror, which recommends just applying Article 19 to internet advertising, which would benefit commercial media. And it's an interesting problem because increasingly the international borders are being eroded by the internet and other services, and the attitudes of people under 30 seem to be in opposition to traditional cultural nationalists like me. After living 10 years outside of Canada, I came back because I wanted to be here. Probably that wouldn't happen, but it seems to me that regulation of advertising is one way to go. And it's kind of an anomaly in a way. It's ironic because those who are producing content were not too happy with the fact that it was being ripped off by Google and Facebook, and they wanted to be compensated. Now people producing fake news are being compensated using the rules that we hoped would benefit content producers. So perhaps the changes were not as well considered as they ought to have been. But if we could redirect funds to traditional journalism, that would be a good idea.
It's going to be sticky though, because the internet opened obviously publishing possibilities to everybody, but it also, thanks to McDonald's and other CEOs, has birthed so-called brand journalism, which isn't journalism at all, but we've got really large newsrooms now inside the headquarters of Coca-Cola claiming to report, and they are, but it's depriving other outlets obviously of lots of Coca-Cola advertising dollars, but they are targeting their journalism to customers. So we can all argue it's not journalism, and there's so many of them now that we have to also fight through and disentangle whether they're advertisers proper or something else.
No, that's increasingly true. That even I'm getting a little fed up with CBC News, which now puts in advertising that looks like news.
Yeah.
But it's important to recognize one reason the advertisers finally got the idea they should move to the internet. They're actually a bit slow. Was that they have a better capacity to target their specific marketing tools to specific audiences, and they also have a better way of finding out if it works. Yeah. Advertising in a daily newspaper was kind of on faith, by and large.
So you've made me think of a whole bunch of things. But to your point, before we used to have the source. The journalist would go to the source in an organization that would give the facts of that organization in order to compose a story. Now that has been flatlined basically, where the company can go directly, or the person, in this case, let's say Trump, can go directly to their target audience and get their message out without having to deal with, and I say deal with in the nicest way possible, to deal with traditional media, snipping and making sound bites and framing it within a storyline. So There are pros and cons, obviously. Facebook has moved off its point of being just a platform. I mean, Zuckerberg took such a hit with saying, hey, we're just a platform, we don't police. And he's had to pull back and is in fact engaging in projects where around the world in terms of having Facebook not only shoot out siloed information, and when I say siloed information, I'm talking about what this gentleman was saying about here's who I follow, here's my tunnel vision because I don't see what else is out there. They're actually engaging in trying to push other sites or other ideas to users so that they can see a wider, broader scope of a specific issue. I think Facebook does have to come a long way in terms of getting out information. People make their own news now, and even the news like Fox and others who are on that 24/7 cycle are just scrambling to just keep pushing it out. Whereas when we used to have the 6 o'clock, the 12 o'clock, the 6 o'clock, 11 o'clock news, you had a longer cycle in which to research information. That's just a few of the ideas that are scrambling in my head right now.
Well, we're trying to think of some other models, so that's what we need to think more about other models of dissemination. Yeah.
I think Garrett was first and then on.
Okay.
I'm changing, my question's going to change.
Yeah, exactly.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of regulation, your idea, so that we can find that balance between the libertarians and sort of a more regulatory notion. I think, which is sad, but we haven't hit the wall of fake news yet. People haven't seen the implications on democracy yet. So I'm thinking in terms of social media and media thinking seriously about child pornography, it had to get to the point where the 13-year-old girl, for example, who was posting naked pictures of herself thinking, this is my body, I can do what I want. We now have laws that say you've just disseminated child porn. Even if it is your own body, you're going to become accountable. In Sweden, we have cyber rape laws. Nowhere else in the world can you rape from a distance over a computer. So I think it has to hit a peak in the social ethos. Right now, Trump is, for many people, a joke. And fake news will go away when he goes away, and I don't think the implications on democracy are clear enough for social grass movements to stand up.
On that point, I think that Europe is more sensitive to the point of how fake news is impacting on their politics. When we look at the elections that came after Trump, and how sensitive they were to ensuring that their electoral base knew what was going on in policing and making sure that those fake news stories didn't, or as much as they could at least, impact on the vote.
Even the Alabama Senate.
Trump, two things about that. Let me comment, and then Europe, generally, the EU is more open to regulations than North America and some other countries. Secondly, number 10 on Donald Trump's list of fake news is the Russian collusion and the election. But the Europeans are actually really worried about RT, the Russian television, and about the apparent collusion there. And so that's part of what's fueling the proposal in France and in other places. So that increasingly that kind of foreign interference is becoming significant. Both the US and Canada outlaw foreign contributions to political parties and candidates. But it's hard to enforce when you have this kind of stuff going on online. It's almost impossible. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was struck by your focusing on the idea of targeting and the inverse contestability. And there is a social media model out there with contestability built in, such as Wikipedia. where everyone sees what's there, and if people disagree, they can go back in and say, no, that's wrong, this is right, and the fight. And I wonder if that's where Facebook, Google, and other targeting media are heading, is introducing some sort of a wiki feature, whereby if something goes out and people become aware of it, not just the people who disagree get the rebuttal, but everybody who got the original message as well. Second, I'm not sure we can regulate. Because today, the problem with this issue of social media is in terms of its development as an industry. It's where newspapers were in the 1890s. We could create a whole infrastructure of regulation, and somebody could think of something new and put it out there 20 minutes later and undermine the whole regulatory infrastructure. Unfortunately, it is probably, if it's going to be practical, have to rely on convincing the corporate barons to do the right thing, just like people in the beginning of the 20th century convinced the newspaper owners that they had civic obligations and that they just couldn't go around race baiting, war baiting, and right? The Spanish-American War was created to sell newspapers, as we all know. If that isn't fake news, what is?
There were robber barons you could point fingers at.
But eventually the media owners were convinced by their employees and by their readers that they had a bigger social purpose than selling newspapers.
Yeah, I think that history, I hope that history is optimistic. Then we
I hope so
find the
too.
same thing. Yeah.
So to follow up on that, maybe perhaps, my question is whether or not you know of any cases that are being brought forward on the libel side, looking at the publication as a publication. So it strikes me that if I stand up on CNN and make outrageous claims, and then that's brought forward, that the traditional media is being shackled in some respects by the law, insofar as it needs to adhere to these standards, and yet the new media doesn't need to do that. And I'm wondering whether there's any cases that have come forward, or that are in the docket that are coming forward, that would sort of attribute such shackles into new media, Facebook or Google as publishers. To me, I don't necessarily think that the regulation would work. I think it would have to come from within a legal framework as holding them liable. And I think that hits the bottom line, and it hits to the responsibility in a much more sound way than trying to create infrastructure around what's in and what's out, and giving a government official the rights to censure and such. And on another note, I understand that FISA, the act in the US, is now starting to target people who stand on television and in websites as foreign agents, and that they're renewing this look into what constitutes a foreign agent and how that will change as well.
Can I just answer that legal question? The defamation laws apply to the internet the same way they would apply if you tried to defame somebody on any communication platform. The problem is enforcement.
Yes. But
and it's the same problem here.
If you treat Google and Facebook as a publisher, as a professional, right? Do we have cases that have treated them as a publisher?
Right now, there are cases trying to do that.
So that's what I was
And that's one of the reasons they're pulling back. You mentioned that.
Yeah.
I mean, they say they're doing it to be so wonderful and everything.
Well, of course, yeah.
But yeah, it's
Liability,
part of the
sure.
reason.
That's-
It's definitely a route, though. It's definitely a good route.
It's the difference between a platform and a publisher, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's just a platform, right? They can wash their hands. But Zuckerberg this week just came out and was talking about the changing around the news that's on Facebook.
Yeah.
Because they either say, we're stepping away and we'll just let you all just be social butterflies on there,
Yeah.
or, we're gonna take some responsibility for
And if you show editorial discretion, such as child pornography or what have you, then you're already showing yourself to be an editor of sorts. You're showing yourself.
And just like Twitter has the verified
That's right.
check mark, and it's, this is, we actually are telling you that this is President Trump. So, what's posted on there, it's
It's
sometimes,
huge.
but,
I mean, what we're asking them to do is to use
Yeah.
a massive editing system, which they say they cannot afford.
We're trying to make people accountable, and there's a lot of accountability is the bottom line principle. Yeah.
All the journalists have been laid off.
Yeah, hire all of us and lay it off.
And this might sound a bit too optimistic, but if you go back to newspapers, like we talk about old media, the earliest newspapers, especially around the time that the First Amendment was being written, they weren't necessarily they were very partisan, they were very ideological. You had communist parties having their own newspapers, you had conservative parties having their own newspapers, and newspapers were pretty partisan. It took time for that medium to evolve, to becoming more responsible. I think with social media, right now it's a baby in its diapers. It hasn't even grown up. It's only been a few years since Twitter started really affecting elections. If you go back maybe Twitter was around when Obama ran against Romney, but it wasn't that important at that time. This is, I think, the first major election where Twitter played a huge role. In the coming years, I think that social media, as it grows up, it might start to become more responsible, like newspapers.
I think part of it, of course, is having people who promote accountability.
Mhm.
And transparency.
But there's your hopes. You see, we're doing good jobs in universities when students are media literate. So even though we've been talking about critical thinking forever and ever, amen, let's not, sort of put it down. It starts with us, the educators, right?
But the media history is accurate.
Yeah.
Up to 1920s, newspapers were very partisan. They remained partisan in Europe forever, in some countries. They remained, but there was a crossover. People knew each other, people were more willing to read the opposing views, and partly that's because there's so much competition for attention now. I mean, almost all of us, though, well, I don't know, that's the question. I've widened my sources because of the internet. I read 2 daily newspapers in print, but I read several others online every day. Part of my job, of course. I've been doing this as part of my scholarship and teaching for almost forever. So in part, there's an underlying condition, which is, for media scholars, is outside the purview of what they usually work on. But where is the kind of partisan and ideological tribalism coming from? We know that we can say that fake news and the social media are fueling it. We can say that they're spreading certain kinds of doctrines. But there's a market for this stuff, whether it's financial or
Migration, fear of
otherwise.
others, it's so multiple.
I'm a big, I haven't given up on media literacy and this sort of thing, but when I look at the birther myth, which has been disproved, it's not exactly something that's been swimming around, in weird sites. It's been examined and disproved time again, and so many people still believe it, including the guy who's the president right now. That's, I think, that's the example. That's the most, to me, that's the worst example of fake news, and it's not resolved. I mean, it's not. So many people still believe it's true.
I mean, it's been disproved.
It's been
Yeah,
disproven,
so many
and
things have been
every
disproved,
journalist
it's still
that yes.
believed.
Yeah.
I've been reading
Although it's the
various.
girther myth, and it's with Trump's way to call it the girther.
But he's preaching
become
to
myths.
a choir, nothing you say will change their minds.
Well, see, but why is that? That's
Why
really
is that?
scary.
Oh, there's,
I mean, after the role is,
Multiple
our
reasons.
role is public education and,
you should
sort
start
of
with
giving
him.
up, yeah.
Some of the American analysts say that part of the reason for this loss of common purpose and the decline of media literacy is bad public schools in the U.S. But they give a
Trump
variety of
was one.
other reasons. I'm less. I'm not so sure about that, and I think it's a real problem. And sometimes it's a problem for all of us. One of my professors, when I was a graduate student, used to say that we aren't immune to responding to emotional appeals or to our own preconceived prejudices as academics. We're just better at rationalizing it. And so one of the things that happens is that people have a point of view, but they don't articulate it very well. And the propaganda-oriented fake news helps them argue in their families or in the bars or wherever it is they argue these things. So that's why talking points are an important strategy in election campaigns, because people say, well, I like so-and-so. Now I need to have reasons so I can justify this response. And that's one of the weaknesses of polls, which I have done a lot of, but people rationalize things that they don't even know themselves the basis for their opinion, which is very depressing for democratic theorists. But,
It was quite interesting that during the U.S. election, when those who were pro-Hillary, they were all following sites that showed her as leading in the campaign, and they really didn't see what was coming in from the sides because they had very much tunneled their vision into whatever they wanted to see. And I think to the point of education, it does need to, as much as you say in public schools, it does need to drill down, because kids are born with I won't even say with a mouse in their hand, because they don't even use a mouse anymore. But we do need to educate people on how to expose themselves to broader thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but also, the other thing is that we need to know that the truth is contextual and social. And so, the postmodern theorists do have some scintilla of rationality in their views, but, and that's not surprising. The question is how to create a common space where people can talk. And one of the things that's been happening is the decline of common space. There's no doubt about it. And it's a serious problem in a large country like the US, or a geographically dispersed one like Canada. It's always been difficult to maintain this kind of common space.
I would think a common space like the House of Representatives or the US Senate, which is concentrated, would be able to talk to each other, but they can't.
No, and that's an interesting dilemma, but I will, by perhaps presaging something that we'll be talking about next week, when I was working for the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform, we went to Harvard to meet with a bunch of American academics and leading senators and others, and they convinced me that the American electoral system is dysfunctional. It's in serious difficulty, insofar as anybody understands it, because there are actually 50 different electoral systems in the US, and but with the unlimited power of money, the absence of effective libel laws for election campaigns as a result of New York Times versus Sullivan. The Supreme Court of the United States has a lot to answer for with Citizens United case and the New York Times versus Sullivan. And, Hillary Clinton was libeled constantly by Trump himself and by his supporters, but she didn't sue. Trump, he sues everybody, so that's a different story. But because it wasn't feasible, politically or legally. We have a better system here. One of the things that the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform did when it came back from the US was double down on some of the things that made us different. Proper independent agencies to draw boundaries, electoral boundaries, limits on election spending, limits on third-party election spending, and then contribution limits to try to make it a real regulated competition where people who weren't rich had a chance to have an influence. Now I'd like to meet a congressman in the US or a congresswoman who leaves Congress less wealthy than they enter.
Good luck.
So there's a problem there, which is different than what we've been talking about, but I wanted to make it more general.
But with that segue to next Monday, for those of you who haven't seen the poster on the wall, here in this place at this time, we will be reviewing the first year of the Trump presidency, and some of these issues will, I am sure, come up in that discussion. I want to close off the formal discussion because I see a lot of people have been having to leave for other commitments. I will volunteer Fred to stay for at least a reasonable period of time for informal continued discussion. Before that, however, I want to thank you for living up to and even exceeding my lavish introduction. And as a token of our appreciation, I want to give you what has become one of the most coveted items at York University. This is something that cannot be bought. It can only be received by giving a talk here at McLaughlin College. So, thank you very much.
Wow, that is